The Columbia River ran cold and grey beneath October skies, its surface rippling with the promise of an early winter. Elias Brannan stood at the edge of Fort George, watching a keelboat drift downstream toward the Pacific, its crew bent against oars that cut the water with rhythmic precision. His breath clouded in the morning air, mixing with the wood smoke that perpetually hung over the trading post like a veil between earth and sky. The smell was familiar, comforting even, cedar and pine burning hot, mixed with the damp earth scent that never quite left the Oregon Territory. Around him, French-Canadian voyageurs hauled bales of beaver pelts from canoes to storage houses, their voices rising in work songs that echoed across the water. Chinook fishermen paddled their cedar canoes past the fort's weathered palisades, their movements fluid and practiced, nets trailing behind them like silver threads in the current. The fort itself was a rough assemblage of log buildings and canvas tents, all surrounded by sharpened stakes that pointed skyward like accusing fingers. It was civilization's precarious foothold in a wilderness that remained largely indifferent to human ambitions. Elias was 32 years old, lean as a lodgepole pine, with pale eyes that seemed to calculate the worth of everything they touched. His buckskin coat was worn smooth at the elbows from years of use, the fringe along the seams stained dark with rain and campfire smoke. His beaver felt hat was perpetually tilted at an angle that suggested either confidence or mockery. Those who knew him could never decide which. There was something about Elias that made people uneasy, even as they trusted him with their business. Perhaps it was the way his smile never quite reached his eyes, or the way he seemed to be listening to conversations, even when he appeared distracted by other matters. He'd been in the Oregon Territory for 6 years, long enough to learn that survival here required more than trapping skill or physical endurance. It required understanding what men feared and what they desired, and knowing how to profit from both. The territory was changing rapidly, filling with settlers who brought their dreams and their prejudices in equal measure. The fur trade that had once been the domain of trappers and tribal traders was becoming corporatized, controlled by the Hudson's Bay Company and its rivals. A man like Elias, who worked the margins between communities and companies, had to be adaptable, had to find opportunities where others saw only problems. Behind him, the door of Morrison's trading house swung open with a groan. Samuel Morrison himself emerged, a thick-bellied Scotsman whose face had been carved by weather into something resembling old leather. "Brannan!" Morrison called, his breath reeking of yesterday's whiskey. "You got business here, or you just admiring the scenery?" Elias turned with that half-smile that had earned him both friends and enemies. "Business, Sam. Always business. I've got something that'll interest you." He reached into his leather satchel and withdrew a small bundle wrapped in worn canvas. When he unfolded it, Morrison's eyes narrowed. Inside lay 3 objects: a carved stone pipe, blackened with age and use, a necklace strung with what appeared to be bear claws and copper beads, and a small wooden mask, its features worn smooth, but still distinctly human. "Found these upriver," Elias said, his voice dropping to a confidential murmur. 3 days north of the Clatsop villages. There's a burial site there, Sam, hidden in the old growth. The locals won't go near it. They say it's cursed. Say the spirits of the dead walk at night, looking for what was stolen from them. Morrison picked up the pipe, turning it over in his broad hands. His expression was skeptical, but Elias could see the flicker of interest in his eyes. Men like Morrison collected such things, not out of respect, but out of a peculiar fascination with what they saw as savage mysticism. "Cursed, you say?" Morrison's tone was mocking, but there was an edge to it. "And what makes you think I want cursed goods in my trading house?" "Because cursed goods sell, Sam. You know it as well as I do. There's a ship captain in Astoria who'll pay $30 for that pipe alone. He collects curiosities for some museum back in Boston. And the settlers." Elias gestured toward the scattered cabins beyond the fort. "They eat up these stories. Give them something to talk about during the long winter, makes them feel like they're living in a land of mystery and danger, which, to be fair, they are. Morrison set the pipe down carefully. The Clatsop won't like this. They've been peaceful enough, but you keep digging up their dead, and that'll change quick. The Clatsop don't know it was me, Elias said smoothly. And they won't. I'm careful, Sam. Always have been. Besides, half the tribes around here are too busy dying from fever to worry about what some white trader does with a few old bones and trinkets. It was cruel but true. Smallpox and influenza had devastated the coastal tribes over the past 2 decades, leaving villages half empty and traditions fractured. The Columbia River, once thick with canoes during salmon season, now seemed almost empty. The survivors were caught between their old ways and the encroaching reality of fur companies, missionaries and settlers who saw the land as empty territory waiting to be claimed. Morrison scratched his beard, then nodded. $20 for the lot, and you didn't get them from me if anyone asks. 25, Elias countered, and I'll throw in a story about how the mask supposedly belonged to a shaman who could turn himself into a raven. Your customers will love it. 23, and we've got a deal. They shook on it. Morrison disappeared into his trading house and returned with a small leather pouch heavy with silver coins. Elias pocketed it without counting, confident in his assessment of Morrison's character. The Scotsman was many things, but a cheat he was not. As Elias walked away from the fort, he felt the familiar satisfaction of a successful trade. The objects had cost him nothing but an afternoon's work, digging in the soft earth of a burial site he'd stumbled upon while checking his trapline. The stories he'd attached to them had cost even less. He'd learned long ago that stories were more valuable than the objects themselves. A carved pipe was just wood and stone, but a cursed pipe from a burial ground haunted by vengeful spirits, that was worth real money. The trail back to his camp wound through dense stands of Sitka spruce and western hemlock, their branches heavy with moss that hung like tattered curtains, filtering the already dim light. Fog rolled in from the coast in thick banks, turning the forest into a cathedral of grey light, where sound became muffled and distance impossible to judge. Elias moved through it with practiced ease, his moccasins silent on the needle-strewn path, his mind already calculating how he'd spend the $23 now weighing down his pocket. New traps, certainly. Maybe a better rifle if he could find one. The winter would be long, and a man needed to prepare. He didn't see the 2 figures watching him from the shadows until he was almost upon them. They stood so still they might have been part of the forest itself, emerging from the fog like materializations of the very stories Elias had been selling. One was a Clatsop man, young and powerfully built, with a face that could have been carved from cedar, all strong lines and steady purpose. He wore a blanket, woven in traditional patterns of black, red and natural wool over buckskin leggings that were decorated with beadwork and porcupine quills. His hair was tied back with strips of otter fur, and there was something in his bearing that spoke of authority beyond his years. The other was older, shorter, his face seamed with age, and what looked like old burns that had healed into glossy scars across one cheek. His eyes were sharp despite the clouding of years, missing nothing. Both carried knives at their belts, not trade knives, but traditional blades of obsidian and bone, weapons that predated the arrival of white men and their steel. Elias stopped walking. His hand drifted toward his own knife, but he kept his expression neutral. "Morning," he said in Chinook jargon, the trade language that had become common along the coast. "Nice day for a walk." The younger man stepped forward. When he spoke, his English was clear but accented. "You are Elias Brannan, the trader who sells stories." "I sell furs mostly," Elias replied carefully, "and sometimes trade goods, same as everyone else in these parts." "You sell lies," the young man said flatly. "You take what belongs to the dead and sell it to the living. You tell stories about curses and spirits, but you know nothing of spirits. nothing of what is sacred. Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. He forced himself to maintain his calm exterior. "I don't know what you're talking about. If someone's been spreading rumors—" "My name is Tyon," the young man interrupted. "I am a scout for my people. 3 days ago, one of our burial sites was disturbed. Sacred objects were taken, objects that were placed there to honor the dead and guide their spirits. You were seen in that area." "Seen by who?" Elias demanded, but even as he said it, he knew it was a mistake. He was admitting too much, showing too much concern. Tyon's expression didn't change. "The forest has many eyes. You cannot move through our lands without being known. What you have done is not just theft, it is desecration. It brings dishonor to the dead and danger to the living." The older man spoke for the first time, his voice like grinding stones. "Return what you took. Make offerings to heal the damage. If you do this, we will speak no more of it." Elias considered lying, denying everything, but something in Tyon's eyes told him it would be pointless. Instead, he chose a different approach. "I can't return what I don't have anymore. I sold those items. That's my trade. I'm sorry if I offended you, but that's the way of things now. Your old ways and our new ways, they don't always fit together." "Then buy them back," Tyon said, "however much it costs. This is not about old ways or new ways. This is about respect for the dead, something your people claim to value as much as mine." "I'll think about it," Elias said, knowing he had no intention of doing any such thing. $23 was more than he made in a month of trapping. Tyon stepped closer, close enough that Elias could smell the wood smoke in his blanket and see the intensity in his dark eyes. "You should know something, trader. The stories you sell are not as false as you think. There are spirits in these lands. They do not forget disrespect, and neither do my people. Think carefully about your next choice." With that, both men melted back into the forest, disappearing into the fog and trees, as silently as they had appeared. Elias stood alone on the trail, his heart hammering in his chest. He told himself it was just a threat, nothing more. But as he continued toward his camp, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The forest seemed darker, the fog thicker. And for the first time since coming to the Oregon Territory, Elias Brannan felt like he was being watched by more than just human eyes. 3 weeks passed, and November brought the rains that would last until spring. Not the gentle rains of other climates, but the relentless, bone-soaking downpours of the Pacific Northwest that could last for days without pause. The Columbia River swelled with runoff from the Cascade Mountains, turning from gray to brown, its current strong enough to carry full-grown trees downstream like twigs, their roots pointing skyward like the grasping fingers of drowning giants. The forest floor became a muddy morass that sucked at boots and made every journey an ordeal of slipping, sliding progress. The sky hung low and heavy, pressing down on the land like a sodden blanket that threatened to smother everything beneath it. Days blurred together in a monotony of gray, the sun a pale memory behind layers of cloud that seemed to have no end. Elias had nearly forgotten his encounter with Tyon and the older man. Nearly, but not quite. The memory lingered at the edges of his thoughts like smoke that wouldn't dissipate, curling back whenever he tried to push it away. He told himself he'd done nothing wrong, nothing that any other trader wouldn't do. The Hudson's Bay Company men traded in furs taken from tribal lands without asking permission. The missionaries traded in souls, converting the natives to Christianity whether they wanted it or not, destroying old beliefs in the name of salvation. Compared to that, what were a few old bones and carved trinkets? A minor transgression surely, nothing to lose sleep over. But the question nagged at him in the quiet moments, when he sat by his fire and listened to the rain drumming on his canvas shelter with a persistence that matched his guilty thoughts. In those moments when darkness pressed close and the fire was his only companion, Elias found himself wondering if there was something to Tyon's warnings after all. Not curses or spirits. He was too practical a man for such superstitions, but consequences. The real human kind of consequences that came from breaking faith with people who'd done you no harm. His camp was situated in a small clearing 3 miles from Fort George, near a creek that provided fresh water and good trapping. The creek ran year-round, fed by springs in the hills, and its banks were thick with willows that rustled in every breeze. He'd built a rough lean-to of cedar planks and canvas, just substantial enough to keep the rain off his furs and supplies, with a stone-lined fire pit that drew smoke away from his sleeping area. It wasn't much, certainly nothing compared to the cabins some settlers were building, but it was his, and that mattered. Here he answered to no company, followed no man's orders, lived by his own rules and his own wits. On the 23rd day of November, a French-Canadian trapper named Jacques Leblanc arrived at Elias's camp, rain dripping from his beard and a worried expression on his weathered face. "Brannan," Jacques said without preamble, "you need to hear what they're saying at the fort." Elias poured him a cup of coffee from the pot that always sat near his fire. "What are they saying?" "That the Indians are getting ready for war. That they're angry about something a white man did, and they're planning to attack the settlements." Jacques wrapped his hands around the tin cup, seeking warmth. "Morrison's spreading stories about cursed goods and angry spirits. Says he got some Indian relics from a trader and now there's trouble. Some of the settlers are talking about forming a militia. Others want to leave before winter really sets in." Elias felt his stomach drop. War. That's ridiculous. The tribes around here have been peaceful for years. Maybe so, but fear doesn't care about logic. You know how it is. Someone sees an Indian with a knife, and suddenly he's a war party. Someone hears a dog howling at night, and its spirits coming for revenge. Jacques took a long drink of coffee. "And Morrison, he's not helping. He's selling those cursed items to anyone who'll pay, telling stories that get bigger every time. Now he's saying the Clatsop have put a curse on Fort George. Says bad luck will follow anyone who stays." "Damn it," Elias muttered. This was worse than he'd expected. He'd sold Morrison those items to make a quick profit, nothing more. But Morrison had taken his fabricated stories and twisted them into something darker, more dangerous, and now it was spiraling out of control. "There's more," Jacques said. "A settler family, the Hendersons. They're missing. Went to check their trapline 4 days ago and never came back. Some folks are saying the Clatsop took them. Others say they just got lost in the rain, or maybe a cougar got them. But with all this talk about Indian trouble, people are assuming the worst." Elias stood up and paced to the edge of his shelter, staring out at the rain-lashed forest. The Henderson family consisted of a husband, wife, and their teenage son, recent arrivals from Kentucky who'd come west with dreams of free land and new beginnings. If they were truly missing, it would inflame tensions even more. "What do you know about the Hendersons?" Elias asked. "Not much. They kept to themselves mostly. The husband, Thomas, he was friendly enough but didn't trust Indians. Made that clear to everyone. His boy was about 15, name of Daniel. The wife was sick a lot, some kind of lung trouble." "Where was their claim?" "North of here, near the Nehalem territory, about a day's ride." Elias's mind was racing. The Nehalem were related to the Clatsop, and their territories overlapped. If the Hendersons had wandered onto sacred ground, or if they'd had a confrontation with tribal members, it could be the spark that ignited a much larger fire. But he also knew something Jacques didn't. The artifacts he'd taken and sold to Morrison had come from that same area, from the burial site Tyan had mentioned. If the Clatsop or Nehalem were angry enough to take action, it was because of him, not the Hendersons. "I need to go to Fort George," Elias said. "Talk to Morrison, try to calm things down." "Good luck with that. Morrison's making too much money off the panic to want it to stop." Jacques drained his coffee and stood. "But you should try. This situation, it's going to get people killed if someone doesn't step in." After Jacques left, Elias spent an hour preparing for the journey to Fort George. He loaded his pistol, checked his knife, and wrapped his most valuable furs in oilcloth to protect them from the rain. But as he worked, his thoughts kept returning to Tyan's words. The stories you sell are not as false as you think. He'd dismissed it as superstition at the time, but now, standing in the cold November rain, with his entire world threatening to collapse around him, Elias wondered if he'd been wrong. Not about spirits and curses, necessarily, but about the consequences of his actions, about the weight of the lies he'd told and the trust he'd broken. The trail to Fort George was treacherous in the rain. The path turned to mud that sucked at his boots with every step. Twice he had to ford swollen creeks, the water icy enough to make his legs ache. By the time he reached the fort, twilight was falling, and the settlement looked more like a fortress preparing for siege than a trading post. Armed men stood at the gates, settlers Elias recognized from the surrounding claims. Their faces were hard, their eyes suspicious. One of them, a farmer named Ezra Walsh, stepped forward with his rifle held ready. "State your business, Brannan." "I need to talk to Morrison," Elias said, "about these stories that are going around." "Stories? Those aren't stories, Brannan. The Hendersons are missing. Indians have been seen near the settlement watching us. And Morrison says you're the one who brought those cursed goods here, says you dug them up from a burial ground." "Morrison's a liar and a profiteer," Elias shot back. "He's using fear to line his pockets. There's no curse, no Indian uprising, just a lot of scared people being manipulated." "Then where are the Hendersons?" Walsh demanded. Elias had no answer for that. After a tense moment, Walsh stepped aside and let him pass. Inside Morrison's trading house, the air was thick with tobacco smoke and tension. A dozen men were gathered around the fireplace, their voices a low rumble of anger and fear. Morrison stood at the center, holding court like a prophet of doom. When Elias entered, the conversation stopped. All eyes turned to him. "Well, well," Morrison said, his voice dripping with false cordiality. "The ghost seller himself. Come to see what trouble your cursed goods have caused. You know those goods weren't cursed, Morrison. I made that up to help you sell them. You've taken that story and turned it into something that's going to get people killed." "Made it up?" Morrison's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. "You mean you lied to me? Sold me stolen goods under false pretenses?" The trap was obvious, but Elias had already walked into it. Anything he said now would only make things worse. "What I mean," Elias said carefully, "is that there's no supernatural danger here. The Clatsop aren't planning war. The Henderson family probably just got lost in the rain or had some other accident. This panic is unfounded. Is that so?" A new voice spoke from the doorway. Elias turned to see Tyan standing there, water dripping from his blanket. The older man from their previous encounter stood beside him, along with two other Clatsop warriors. They were unarmed, their hands visible, but their presence sent a ripple of tension through the room. Several settlers reached for their weapons. Morrison raised a hand. "Hold! Let's hear what they have to say." Tyan's eyes met Elias's for a long moment before he spoke. "We have come to speak truth, not make threats. The man you call Henderson and his family are safe. They became lost in the forest during the rains. We found them, gave them shelter and food, and guided them back to the trail. They should be here by morning." A murmur ran through the gathered settlers. "Then why didn't you bring them here yourself?" Walsh demanded. "Why all the secrecy?" "Because Henderson's son became sick with fever," Tyan replied. "Our healer treated him, but he needed rest. We would have brought them sooner, but the trail was dangerous. Now he is well enough to travel." The older man stepped forward and spoke in halting English. "We come also to speak of sacred things that were taken. Objects from the resting place of our ancestors. These must be returned. If they are not, there will be consequences, not from us, but from what has been disturbed." "There's your curse," Morrison said triumphantly. "They're threatening us." "We threaten nothing," Tyan said sharply. "We warn of imbalance. When the dead are dishonored, when sacred objects are stolen and traded like beaver pelts, it creates disharmony. This affects all who live on this land, white and Indian alike." He turned to look directly at Elias. "The trader who took these objects knows who he is. He knows what he did. Let him make it right, and there will be peace. Let him continue, and there will be only sorrow." With that, Taian and his companions left as silently as they'd arrived, disappearing into the rain-dark night. The trading house erupted in angry voices. Morrison was already spinning the encounter into evidence of Indian hostility, but Elias barely heard him. He was staring at the door through which Taian had vanished, feeling the weight of choices he'd made and consequences he couldn't avoid. For the first time since coming to the Oregon Territory, Elias Brannan understood what real fear felt like. And it had nothing to do with ghosts or curses. It had everything to do with the knowledge that his lies had created a situation where innocent people might die, and he was the only one who could stop it. The Henderson family arrived at Fort George the following morning, just as Taian had promised. They were exhausted, muddy, and the boy was still pale from his illness, but they were alive and unharmed. Thomas Henderson confirmed everything Taian had said. The Clatsop had saved them, treated them with kindness, and asked for nothing in return except respect for their lands and traditions. It should have ended the panic. It should have proven that there was no Indian uprising, no curse, no danger beyond the ordinary hardships of frontier life. But Morrison had stoked the flames of fear too well, and fear, once lit, is hard to extinguish. "They're lying," Morrison insisted to anyone who would listen. "The Indians probably threatened them, made them say those things. Or maybe the Hendersons are too scared to tell the truth." Some settlers believed him. Others weren't sure what to believe. And a dangerous middle ground emerged. People who thought the Clatsop might be peaceful now, but could turn hostile if provoked. This made them jumpy, quick to see threats where none existed, ready to shoot first and ask questions later. Elias spent 2 sleepless nights wrestling with his conscience, a faculty he'd thought long dormant from years of doing whatever was necessary to survive and profit. The wind howled through the trees outside his shelter, and rain hammered against the canvas with a fury that seemed personal, as if the weather itself was passing judgment on his actions. He lay on his bedroll, staring up at the canvas ceiling that leaked in 3 places, catching the drips in tin cups that pinged with each drop, measuring time in a rhythm that felt like accusation. He could confess, admit what he'd done, and try to make things right. But confession meant admitting to theft and desecration in front of men whose respect he'd worked years to earn. It meant losing his position as a trader, the reputation he'd built as someone who could navigate between the white and Indian worlds. It meant facing legal consequences. Theft was theft, whether the victims were white settlers or tribal people, even if the law rarely protected the latter. And it meant spending money he'd already spent on winter supplies and new traps. Money he couldn't afford to lose, with months of cold weather ahead and no guarantee he'd make it through to spring. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw Taian's face, heard his words. Let him make it right, and there will be peace. Let him continue, and there will be only sorrow. On the 3rd night, Elias made his decision. He would get the artifacts back somehow, return them to the burial site. And if that meant going into debt or losing his trading position, so be it. Some prices were too high, even for a man who'd spent years profiting from lies. The next morning, he went to Morrison's trading house. The Scotsman was counting coins behind his counter, a satisfied smile on his weathered face. Business had been good. Fear sold better than whiskey. "Brannan," Morrison said without looking up, "come to sell me more cursed goods? I'm afraid the market's saturated. Everyone who wanted a piece of Indian mysticism has bought one." "I want to buy them back," Elias said flatly. Morrison's head came up slowly. "You want to what?" "The artifacts I sold you. I want them back. Name your price." A calculating look crossed Morrison's face. "Why would you want them back, unless there's something to these cursed stories after all? Does it matter? Will you sell them or not?" "I already sold them, Brannan. The pipe went to that ship captain, like I said. The necklace went to a settler woman who wanted it for good luck. And the mask," Morrison's smile widened, "the mask is hanging over the fireplace in the common room. Consider it decoration." Elias felt despair settle over him like fog. I need to get them back, Sam. All of them. Can you help me or not? For a price, I could try. The mask is easy enough. I'll sell it to you for $50. The necklace will cost you whatever I can negotiate with Mrs. Patterson, plus my commission. The pipe? Morrison shrugged. That ship sailed yesterday, bound for San Francisco. You'd have to go after it, and even then, good luck convincing a sea captain to sell back his curiosity. $50 for the mask alone was more than twice what Elias had received for all 3 items, but he nodded. Do it. Get the mask and the necklace. I'll figure out the pipe somehow. It took 3 days and cost Elias nearly everything he'd saved. Mrs. Patterson, a widow who'd bought the necklace, refused to sell it back at first, convinced it had brought her good fortune. It took Elias offering her double what she'd paid, plus a promise to trap extra beaver pelts for her through the winter before she agreed. The mask came down from Morrison's wall at the cost of $50, and Elias's pride. The pipe was impossible. The ship was long gone, and Elias had no way to follow it. He'd have to return what he could, and hope it was enough. On a grey December morning, Elias wrapped the mask and necklace in clean canvas and set out for the burial site. He knew the way well. It was burned into his memory from that afternoon of easy theft that had seemed so profitable at the time. The walk took most of the day, the trail slippery with rain and fallen leaves. The forest was quiet, except for the drip of water from branches and the occasional call of a raven. The burial site was exactly as he'd left it. A small clearing surrounded by ancient cedar trees, their trunks so wide that 3 men couldn't circle them with outstretched arms. The ground was slightly raised in places, marking where the dead had been laid to rest. Elias had disturbed one of these mounds, digging carefully to extract the artifacts without collapsing the entire structure. Now he knelt in the same spot and began the careful work of restoration. He dug a shallow hole, placed the mask and necklace inside, and covered them with earth. It wasn't perfect. The pipe was still missing, and he had no way to undo the desecration he'd caused. But it was something, an acknowledgement of wrong done, and an attempt, however inadequate, to make it right. As he worked, Elias became aware that he wasn't alone. He looked up to find Tyann standing at the edge of the clearing, watching him with an unreadable expression. "I'm returning what I can," Elias said quietly. "The pipe is gone. A ship captain bought it and sailed away, but the mask and necklace are here. I'm putting them back where they belong." Tyann crossed the clearing and knelt beside him. For a long moment he was silent, looking at the freshly turned earth. Then he spoke. 2 out of 3. It is something, more than I expected, if I'm honest. "It's not enough," Elias said. "I know that, but it's all I can do." Why did you do this? Take these things in the first place?" Tyann's voice wasn't accusatory, just curious. Elias sat back on his heels, considering the question. "Money. That's the simple answer. I saw something I could sell, so I took it. I didn't think about what it meant to you, to your people. I just thought about what I could get for it. And now? Now I understand that some things are worth more than money. That the stories we tell, the lies we live by, they have consequences. Real ones." Elias looked at Tyann. "I created a ghost in a way, a false story that took on a life of its own and nearly started a war. That's going to haunt me more than any curse." Tyann nodded slowly. "Perhaps that is the real curse, not spirits or magic, but the weight of what we do, and the truth we must carry afterward." They finished the work together, Tyann showing Elias the proper way to arrange the earth, the words that should be spoken to honor the dead. When it was done, the burial site looked almost as it had before Elias's violation. Almost, but not quite. Some wounds don't heal completely. As they prepared to leave, Elias hesitated. What about the settlers at Fort George? Morrison's still spreading fear. People are still on edge. How do we fix that? "We?" Tyann raised an eyebrow. "I started this mess. I should help clean it up." For the first time, Tyann smiled. It transformed his serious face, making him look younger. "Then come with me. There is someone you should meet, someone who can help us find a path forward." Tyann led Elias through the forest to a Clatsop village that sat at the confluence of 2 rivers. a location chosen by ancestors who understood the importance of water as both highway and boundary. The village was older than any white settlement in the territory, its existence measured in generations rather than years. It consisted of several longhouses made from cedar planks, their roofs pitched steep to shed the constant rain. Each longhouse was large enough to shelter multiple families, with carved posts at the entrances depicting clan symbols and ancestral spirits. Smoke rose from central fire pits, visible through gaps in the roof planks designed for ventilation, and the smell of cooking salmon hung in the damp air. Salmon that had been caught, cleaned, and set to smoke over alder wood fires that burned day and night. Children playing near the water stopped to stare at Elias as he passed, their games of stick and hoop forgotten in the novelty of seeing a white man walk through their village with Tayan. Some of the younger ones had probably never seen a white person up close before. Women working at drying racks looked up with wary eyes, their hands never stopping their work even as they assessed this stranger. They were preparing winter stores, splitting fish and hanging strips of venison to dry, work that couldn't be delayed for curiosity or concern. The men who sat near the fires made no move to welcome or threaten. They simply watched with the patient attention of those who'd learned to be cautious, measuring this white stranger who walked with Tayan as if he had a right to be there. The person Tayan wanted Elias to meet was an elder named Kaliska. She was perhaps 70 years old, though age was difficult to judge in a face that had seen so much. Her hair was white as frost and worn in 2 long braids that fell past her shoulders, decorated with shells and beads that clicked softly when she moved. Her face was a landscape of deep lines that spoke of laughter and sorrow in equal measure, each wrinkle a story, each mark a memory. She sat outside one of the longhouses despite the cold, wrapped in a blanket of mountain goat wool, weaving a basket from spruce root, with hands that moved with practiced certainty despite their age. The basket was taking shape beneath her fingers, each strand placed with precision, born of decades of practice, the pattern emerging like magic from seemingly random movements. "Grandmother," Tayan said respectfully, using the term of respect for elders rather than claiming actual kinship. "This is Elias Brannan, the trader I spoke of. He has returned what he took, most of it at least." Kaliska looked up, and Elias found himself pinned by eyes that seemed to see more than he wanted to show. She studied him for a long moment, then gestured to a log that had been smoothed and placed near her work area as a bench. "Sit," she said in English that carried only a faint accent. "You have walked a long way to face what you have done. That deserves recognition, even if it does not erase the deed itself." Elias sat, feeling like a schoolboy called before a stern but fair teacher. "I want to make things right. Not just with the burial site, but with the fear and mistrust I've caused between your people and the settlers." "That fear existed before you," Kaliska said, her fingers never stopping their weaving. "It has been growing for many years, fed by misunderstanding and by the changes your people bring to our lands. You did not create it. You only gave it a new shape, a new story to tell itself." "Then how do we change the story?" "By telling the truth," Kaliska said simply. "You sold lies because lies were profitable. Now you must sell truth even though it will cost you. You must go to your people and tell them what you did. Tell them there is no curse except the one men make with their own actions. Tell them the Klatsops seek peace, not war, and that fear serves no one except those who profit from it." "They won't believe me," Elias said. "Morrison has too much influence, and I have too little credibility after what I've done." "Then you must find others who will stand with you. Truth is stronger when it is spoken by many voices." She finally looked up from her weaving, meeting his eyes directly. "Tayan will speak for our people. You will speak for yours. And perhaps there are others, white and Indian both, who are tired of fear and ready for something better." Over the next hour, they crafted a plan. It would require Elias to do something he'd never done before, be completely honest about his actions and their consequences. It would require Taiyan to take a risk by bringing Clatsop representatives into Fort George at a time when tensions were high, and it would require them to find allies among both communities who were willing to choose peace over profit. The first person Elias approached was Jacques Leblanc. The French-Canadian trapper listened to Elias's confession with a mixture of disappointment and understanding. "I suspected it was you," Jacques admitted, "but I hoped I was wrong. What you did was foolish, Elias. Disrespectful, but at least you're trying to make it right. Will you help me? Stand with me when I tell people the truth?" Jacques sighed. "Yes, because someone needs to stop this madness before blood is spilled. Morrison's playing a dangerous game, and he doesn't care who gets hurt as long as he profits." The next ally came from an unexpected source. Thomas Henderson, the settler whose family had been helped by the Clatsop, sought out Elias at his camp 3 days after Elias's return from the village. "I heard what you're planning," Henderson said without preamble. "A council. White folks and Indians talking together, trying to calm things down. My family owes those people our lives. I'll stand with you. I'll tell anyone who'll listen that the Clatsop are not our enemies." Others followed, not many, but enough. A missionary's wife who'd lived near the Nehalem for years and learned their language. A young settler named Robert Chen, whose Chinese father had taught him about the cost of prejudice and fear. And several trappers who'd worked alongside Indian guides and knew the difference between stories and reality. The council was set for the first week of January 1823 to be held in the common room of Fort George. Morrison tried to prevent it, arguing that allowing Indians into the fort was dangerous. But enough settlers wanted answers, wanted peace, that his protests were overruled. On the day of the council, Elias stood before a room full of settlers, traders and trappers, with Taiyan and 3 other Clatsop representatives standing to one side. The common room was packed to capacity, bodies pressed close in the winter cold, breath steaming in the air, despite the fire roaring in the hearth. Faces Elias recognized from years of trading looked back at him with expressions ranging from curiosity to hostility. Some were friends, or had been. Others had never liked him, suspicious of a man who seemed too comfortable moving between worlds. His hands were shaking. He could feel the tremor in his fingers and hoped others couldn't see it. But his voice was steady as he began to speak, finding strength in the simple act of finally telling the truth. "My name is Elias Brannan, and I'm the man responsible for the fear that's been eating at this community. Not because of any curse or Indian uprising, but because I lied for profit." He told them everything, about the burial site, the stolen artifacts, the fabricated stories he'd sold to Morrison, about how those lies had been twisted and amplified until they'd nearly caused a war, and about how Taiyan and the Clatsop had responded not with violence, but with offers of peace and attempts to return what had been taken. When he finished, the room was silent. Then Morrison spoke up, his voice dripping with scorn. "So you admit you're a liar and a thief. Why should we believe anything you say now?" "Because I have nothing left to gain from lying," Elias replied. "I've spent every dollar I had to buy back those artifacts and return them. I've destroyed my reputation by confessing. The only thing I stand to gain from the truth is peace of mind. And maybe, if we're lucky, peace between our communities." Thomas Henderson stood up. "I believe him, and I believe the Clatsop. They saved my family when they could have left us to die. That's not the action of people planning war." Others joined in, their voices creating a chorus of support for peace over panic. Not everyone was convinced. Some settlers remained suspicious, certain that this was all a trick, but enough minds were changed that the immediate danger of violence passed. Taiyan spoke last, his words simple but powerful. "My people do not